Hello world! To the surprise of not a single person, I have been simping hard for the indomitable Iggy ever since issue 1 of Overwatch's London Calling. And tell you what, I ain't stopping anytime soon. Iggy is a fantastic new addition to the Overwatch cast, but she was sadly held back by the terrible story she was introduced with, but that she's no longer stuck with it. And so I'm here to outline why she's so damn good, and why London Calling is so damn bad. Now, the comic itself does have a pretty solid structure to work with, and even has some flashes of brilliance from time to time, but it's ultimately let down by terrible pacing caused by shallow conflicts, which themselves taint the story's rushed resolutions even more so by also making them emotionally and tangibly unimpactful. Nothing matters, nothing happens. That is obviously me being harsh, as the focus on the London Omnics in this story is definitely appreciated, as it helps to flesh out their wider perspectives. But this also ends up detracting from the more personally relevant dilemmas and ideals of the focal characters, and kinda only offers lip service to the ideologies at play, or is then too shallow or broad in its appraisal of those ideas. The setting and time period then also severely detriment London Calling based on our current presence in the Overwatch world, as it provides additional context, but no real meaningful development to one of the earliest revealed current events of the Overwatch canon, Mondata's assassination. Very little new information can actually be taken from this comic series, and the world and characters that exist beyond it haven't shown any reasonable degree of change so as to even suggest that this story could offer meaningful character development, which of course it didn't. The series itself is just horribly paced, with several non-obstacles overcome through no genuine effort, cost, or development from the characters at hand, and features a conclusion that is somehow simultaneously rushed, yet unbearably drawn out. Then you have cliffhangers spoiled by their own design choices, plot points that end up with no real significance, empty conflicts that the series also acknowledges as pointless, toothless threats with simple circumstances for resolution, and a set of 3 distinct character arcs that were done no justice whatsoever, even when the right elements were in play for them to do so. Iggy's arc of finding balance between humans and Omnics is one that's actually really present here, but it's ultimately made really hollow through poor plotting and empty conflicts, those two again, which denies her an actual challenge, an opportunity to meaningfully grow, and a tangible means to display that growth. Being totally hand-waved out of her part in Tracer's arc at the very end doesn't help that either, even if you do imagine that her channeling the will of the Iris through Lust for Life helps Tracer recover, and not having Iggy briefly transcend at the end so as to pull the bullet out of Tracer is an absolutely missed opportunity to tangibly demonstrate her conviction, her compassion, and her recently expanded level of understanding. What some could call transcendental, right? The kind of thing that does something actually impactful in the present and also hugely sets her up for the future. The pieces are there, right? They're just not joined up with any actual substance. Iggy and Tracer needed to actually fall out, so then they could actually make up, and they needed some actual tangible way of showing how much faith they had in each other so they could actually make up from that decision, from that circumstance, from that action. Let's move away from them for a sec. Kace was actually a pretty good opportunity to present a sympathetic and understandable antagonist, even if he wasn't redeemable, right? Expressing the sad truth that societal change only kind of happens under duress and at a cost. But that all just ends up getting undercut really heavily by Kace being the one to devalue his own beliefs, threatening Omnics when he was meant to be working in their favour, not offering any insight on the actual ethics of achieving justice, the kind of things you have to do, the struggles with balancing those ideologies against the reality of the situation, and then finally in becoming just a cartoonishly childish villain who has no actual followers, and therefore no legitimate ideology as presented by the story, and so presents no real threat even when throwing a fucking tantrum. Teasing him as maybe being part of Null Sector, when we'd all figured out that the Omnic rights activist advocating violence was probably part of Null Sector before we even met him, then just proves that they can't even execute on the single piece of actual plot development that they had in a satisfying manner. Way to make Null Sector look tame. Oh, tame. That said, Tracer. Tracer, on the other hand, at least gets a sort of an arc through this story, but it's not pretty. Tracer is presented distinctly as lacking a sense of purpose at the beginning, and by the end she certainly achieves such, through her social vampirism of the London Omnics, only to then be whisked back off to Overwatch at the end, fresh purpose in tow, as if none of it ever happened. Just to clarify, I'm saying that Tracer's a social vampire. She'll help anybody she can just to feel alive. But that sort of toxic character flaw obviously can't apply to the game's face of positivity and hopefulness, and so it's all presented as like wholly praiseworthy, brave, and self-sacrificing. Even when she doesn't actually show any genuine reason that she cares for the Omnics, when she gets rewarded for throwing her spindly body at everybody else's problems, basically ignoring any of the consequences, and her girlfriend's concerns that might have actually addressed this are given nowhere near the screen time of Tracer's actual new girlfriend, who is also woefully neglected. If Tracer and Iggy actually had a genuine reason to forgive each other, such as Tracer actually choosing not to save Mondata, or somehow contributing to Lady's death, giving Iggy an actual reason to lose faith in her, Tracer taking a bullet at the end would have actually been a really fitting action to resolve all of the central conflicts in one fell swoop. Could have been the thing that also stopped Kace as well, in some fashion. It's a good moment in theory, but it still wouldn't have mattered with the story as written, as Tracer and Iggy had already forgiven each other anyway for the meaningless shit that had happened, as they apparently wandered the tunnels for hours. This final chapter, man, this is exactly what I mean by rushed plotting and empty conflicts. Never mind the grossly artificial Tracer didn't stop the bullet bullshit from the end of chapter 2, the series as a whole just keeps throwing up meaningless roadblocks that are resolved through unearned interjection, usually by third parties. And then he'll even spoil those reveals through cover art and shit like that. It often tells when it should show, and it regularly doesn't back up the show it does do with enough telling. We knew already that nothing had changed with King's Row or Tracer beyond this story. And so that obviously discouraged readers from getting engaged in the first place, right? And it also must have limited the writers in how they could actually develop the world and the characters. It's flawed just existing as it is. This inherently made the events that did happen shallow and lacking any sense of tension, which then reinforces the audience's existing perception, how we've seen this series, that it's not substantial, or impactful, or meaningful in any way, and so isn't worth anyone's time. That was a lot of people's issue with Hero of Numbani, for as good as that book actually is on its own merit, which speaks to the curse of overexposure that has harmed more Overwatch works than just those two examples, right? To be honest, using Tracer in herself was kind of a bad idea. We've already seen way more than enough of her, a long time ago. So to see her again in one of the very few modern situations that we already know all too well didn't really excite anyone, right? Especially after several years of knowing the events of Alive. Expanding on the London Omnics, as I said, was a great idea. Sure, that needed some expansion. But that greater societal focus often detracted from the main characters, as I said, even though it does work as a good framing device. But then the Omnics themselves weren't given enough space or time to expand on their own various perspectives, with not even the supporting cast having the time they needed to develop into understandable characters, which then ended up removing a lot of weight from their actions and their loss. I'm truly starting to fear that Overwatch has gotten to the point of using Omnics purely as plot devices, rather than actual living beings. They've literally been built to fulfill an inconsequential story purpose, and then be thrown to the wayside. Kinda misses the whole fucking point just a little bit, don't you think? Lizzy fixing the chronal accelerator. That would have been a great opportunity to show why they're so talented with machines, developing their genuine interest in what makes everything work on a physical level, potentially including Lizzy themselves. She could have given us loads of insight into Omnics, right? Lady didn't get any time to really show us who she actually was, and so her death ends up feeling incredibly cheap. Never mind avoidable, right? And it was an event that could have really been used, as I said, to drive a wedge between Iggy and Tracer if there'd been any actual involvement on either of their parts. Lady did sort of show how much they cared for others in their final actions, right? which embodies the themes of self-sacrifice in a much more meaningful way than any other attempt in this comic. But this again is kind of just undercut by a lack of substantial development leading up to it, the lack of sort of consequence to a barely developed supporting character dying off, and the actual execution of the event. Execution is one of the greatest issues with London Calling, which makes it even more of a shame that it wasn't actually building to any sort of payoff at BlizzCon line. There's loads of elements here that could be used to make a much better story. The chronology, location, and existing character choices definitely did detract from the base idea in certain ways, but they also facilitated the addition of a brave new face into the Overwatch world, right? And so I'd argue a straightforward rewrite of the same core narrative, or some kind of retcon, could actually suffice to redeem this work, if that was ever possible, or desired. I guess they don't really care about it at this point. Either way, Iggy herself, the whole point of this video, she does now stand out as a potential main character, despite the mess that she's come from. She's been set up as a focal Omnic leader, possessing great understanding, compassion, conviction, and nuance for both sides of the human-Omnic divide, someone who can help shape the progression of the underground into the future. But she does have her own goals to consider as well. Iggy's concern about the finite number of Omnics could lead to a further quest that she wishes to embark on for all of Omnic kind, most likely to discover the secrets of Aurora and the First Transcendence, so that she can replicate it or even improve upon it herself. Not only that, but a potential shortcut to accessing the Iris could already exist through the pieces of Lady that Iggy has welded to her body, almost forcibly giving her a direct link or conduit to the afterlife, in which Lady's consciousness now resides, back in the all-encompassing light of collective Omnic thought, the Iris. This also sets you up for a really cool potential moment for Lizzy going forward, if you ask me. Never mind an actual power set for Iggy, but you should check my video on how the Iris can work as an endlessly expansive power system and personally motivated narrative device, linked above and below for more on all that bullshit, because we haven't even spoken about Iggy's character design yet, as she's obviously absolutely fucking adorable, with a punky twist, wearing her boundless heart on her sleeve, individually distinct yet very distinctly Omnic, having altered her own clothes and physiology in order to express exactly who she is, through homage to her past with humans and the birth of her love of music, patches showing varied influences collecting into this singular defined whole, her striking blue mohawk calling our attention, flared legs carrying her determined stride, and her dead friend welded to her chest. If that doesn't say something about her character, I don't know what fucking would. Iggy enters the Overwatch canon with strong-ass themes of fighting the system through compassion, bearing the cost of sacrifice, finding the balance in helping humans and Omnics, and using music to bring them all together through determinate cause, which also certainly fits the universe in terms of an understandable power set. I myself do have a genuine story trajectory for Iggy in mind, as London Calling doesn't have to be the end of her adventures by any means, and if you ask me, there's a strong possibility it won't be. So, stick around on the channel if you want to hear more about that, because that's all from me and our resident Robo-Rocker for today. Thank you for staying with me, friends. For all my complaining, I honestly do hope you found something good to take out of London Calling, although I really can't blame you if that's just Iggy. I've been Euclidean Vision, the emotional support. Take care of yourselves out there, teammates, and may you forever be filled with a genuine lust for life, as the glorious light of Best Girl shines within you. Bye-bye.